A new poll shows Doug Ford's support has collapsed, and the British Prime Minister resigns after the failure of Brexit. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. It's been a pretty bad day for political figures today. The Premier of Ontario is failing. The British Prime Minister has resigned. Wow. Is the world ending? Well, no, not exactly. Let's start with the Ontario story. A Main Street research poll released on Thursday puts the Progressive Conservative Party in third place behind the Liberals and the NDP, with only 22.4% of voters saying they would cast a ballot for the party if an election was held today. Now, third place doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's effectively last. Outside of the Liberal Party and the Conservatives, the NDP might be a challenge, but definitely outside of those three, it's a big drop-off. Being third out of those effectively means you are the least likely to be elected, and there's pretty much no chance for you to regain power. If you look at the fourth most popular party, the Green Party, you can see the drastic change in expectation. They're celebrating after winning a single seat. So, yeah, not good news for the Ontario Conservative Party. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is now less popular than Kathleen Wynne was at the end of her premier term. That's pretty astounding. Really, think about it. Wynne essentially destroyed the Liberal Party. If you recall, the last provincial election left the Liberal Party not even with enough seats to claim official party status, and they currently don't have an officially recognized leader. Who wants to clean up that mess? Doug Ford has outdone himself and successfully become less popular than that. That's quite outstanding, and it deserves a round of applause. Truly record-breaking. Oddly enough, at least in my opinion, it feels like one of the only reasons why Ford was such a popular candidate was because everyone else wanted Wynne gone, so they went to the next most likely party to win. It wasn't going to be the NDP with their radical socialist regime, so the moderates flocked to the Conservatives, and it propelled Doug Ford. In a race with a more, how you could say, suitable candidate for the Liberal Party, I fully expect that race to be a lot closer, and it's probable Doug Ford wouldn't have won in the first place, but it was the perfect storm. The Liberal Party had fallen off drastically, and people were looking for a replacement. They didn't care too much about the policies per se, because all they wanted was someone else. Not the ideal voting strategy, but that's what happened, and this is where we are now. The Main Street poll also found that just 19.9% of respondents say they have a favorable opinion of Ford. That's only 1 out of every 5 people think Ford is doing good, or rather they have a positive insight towards the work he's been doing, while 73.4% say they have a negative opinion of the Premier. That is a vast majority, and it's a clear indication that he's been doing something wrong, and he's pissed off a lot of people. One contributing factor to that is the fact that he's been a heavy pusher for budget cuts, and those, as I mentioned before, are typically perceived in a negative light, almost always. It's just the nature of cuts. It's the same thing for increasing taxes. Even if it's for a good cause, nobody wants to spend more money in terms of taxes, so it will probably have a strong opposition force. The same thing can be said for a lot of cuts. People don't like the idea of money leaving these, I guess you could call them, services and initiatives that Ontario has been funding for the past term. Now that money is seeping out, people are worried about certain efficiencies being lost even, and on top of that, the fact that some of these programs may suffer. Now, that's a general example, and doesn't take into the context what kind of cuts Doug Ford used. There's nothing wrong with certain cuts here and there per se, but Doug Ford made a complete fool of himself, I believe. He targeted the completely wrong sectors, and as a result, he received massive backlash, more than regular, and I feel like it was justified in a lot of cases. Not all of them, but definitely enough of the mainstream ones where his reputation took a massive downfall as a result. Simply put, he has not done things the right way. With great cuts come great responsibility, and he squandered that. His support is collapsing, says Quinto Maggie, the president and CEO of Main Street Research, in a statement. She also mentions that we have never seen an incumbent premier reach these depths in popular opinion with barely a year into his mandate. As I said before, truly record-breaking. Doug Ford is checking off all the check boxes here for unpopularity and disdain. People clearly do not like him. Even in recent memory, I can't think of any other premier who has amassed this much hate in such a short span of time. But if you want to look at it from another perspective, it's getting a lot of people more involved in politics, and it's making people aware of what's really going on in government, which is a good thing. People are up in arms, they don't approve of the policies, so they're doing research, protesting, finding ways to fight back with good arguments. Overall, I would say that's a positive effect. The cuts themselves, not so much, but people are becoming incentivized to get knowledgeable about what exactly is happening, and that's definitely a good thing. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but there's one silver lining. So, where does Doug Ford go from here if he wants to repair his reputation? It's a pressing question, and I'm sure it's running through his mind nonstop. It's very obvious that he does want a second term, like all other politicians, so he's going to need to make a drastic change. With 75% of people disapproving of you, there's no way he's going to win election, and I fear it'll be a replica of what got him there in the first place. Nobody wanted Kathleen win. The approval ratings were so low that almost anyone could beat her. If the same thing happens again, where almost anyone can beat Doug Ford, it's not a competitive election, and this means the bar is lowered, and it means there's a chance for a ill-suited candidate to swoop in and win based on that merit alone. Not because they're a good candidate, but because people just want a replacement and anyone will do. It's not a good situation, and it's one reason why only really having two dominating parties in a system is a terrible idea. There's not enough selection, and if one side is lacking, it makes it tremendously easy for the other party to win. You can see that as well in the federal election. Trudeau has been involved in scandal after scandal, and his support is tanking. Andrew Scheer seems to be the leader just by default as a result. Not because people like his policy. Nobody really even knows what Andrew Scheer stands for. Only recently have people done research into him because it seems very likely he's going to win, or at the very least, he's going to be a massive player in that battle. You don't want a situation like that. You want somebody to win because they deserve it, not because the other party just sucks. So hopefully he can turn it around, not only for himself, but for the sake of democracy. Right now, we're in a weird situation where Doug Ford is really teetering on the edge of complete irredeemability. Ironically, the key to success for him lies within money, the same very tool that got him into this mess in the first place. He's largely based his entire political career around the concept of cuts, aka capital, money, the green stuff that makes the world go round. That's been Doug Ford's mandate, and it's essentially all he's really been known for. In this case, it's the opposite of spending. He is cutting and taking money away from different initiatives and resources. So, he's the cut man. People don't like cuts. Maybe if he cut a little bit smarter, he could have saved some of his support, but he hasn't done that. He's effectively alienated everybody. He's cut OSAP. The students don't like him. He's cut AI research. All the engineers, scientists, and research people, they don't like him. High school education's been slashed. Teachers don't like him. Other budgets have been slashed. Healthcare people don't like him. Unions don't like him. The list goes on and on and on. And I really wonder, who are his allies here? So, if he wants to turn it around, you've got to find creative ways to restore these facilities and show that you really care. Make a new program to support students. Make post-secondary education debts less hostile. His move to make OSAP debts immediately accrue interest as soon as the person graduates is a backwards move, and it impedes a student's success rates because now as soon as they graduate, they have to pay it back. There's no grace period, and a lot of people struggle to find jobs right away. It's a recipe for disaster. It might help the government in the short term by earning a little bit of money off the backs of these poor students, but in the long run, it creates a negative sentiment, and people lose a certain motivation to even get educated in the first place. That's not good for society at large. You can even take some very necessary mandates, such as reducing the wait time our healthcare system currently has. All very good initiatives, but so far, none of them have been undertaken. Also, if you really want to impress millennials and earn back some votes, how about taking the environment a little bit more seriously? People will definitely give you kudos for doing something like that. The cuts can't go on for much longer without society crumbling and him losing every piece of support he currently has left. Most services have already been scrutinized, and I don't know where else he can look. What will his reputation become when they get past this cutting antic? That is for him to craft. One thing that's for sure is that time is quite on his side. People place far more weight on more recent political moves compared to old ones. When an election occurs, people tend to vote more so on the last year or two of the premier or the Prime Minister, or even the President's body of work. It's called the recency bias. You can even compare this to something in your own personal life. If you have a partner, for example, and right now they're giving you a hard time, you tend to put more weight on that compared to the grand scheme of things. You might have had 2 years of great times, but the past couple months have been terrible, so you're more influenced by that and you're likely going to make a decision based on that time frame. But on the other hand, if you had a really bad first couple of months, but now in the last month things are looking really peachy, you might be more inclined to believe that narrative of the story. It's just the way people are wired, and without realizing that it's a bias, people are going to be led to vote based on that. So, Doug Ford, he still has a long way to go until the next Ontario election. He's faced some scandals early, but he can always rebound. A few solid years of positive impact. That's enough for most people. You can frame that in multiple progressive ways, like, for example, he didn't know what he was doing for the first couple years, but he's made a change for the better. He deserves another term. He's redeemed himself. It's a story of the fallen hero, for example. And it's certainly craftable, but oddly enough, as I mentioned before, he's really teetering on the line here. Doug Ford is not far away from irredeemability. He's already amassed such a reputation for himself where he can just keep falling off and never climb back up. Somebody like Trudeau, I feel like he's in a similar situation. He's teetering there too. A lot of people already have very solidified feelings about him, and they won't vote for him regardless of what happens next. And Doug Ford, same boat. They need to really strap down and make a change for the better immediately if they want to impact their chances of being reelected. Doug Ford has more time, Trudeau does not. So, we'll see how that plays out. Now we get to our next story. Another example of a political icon falling from grace. Today, UK Prime Minister Theresa May finally gave in to the intense political pressure mounting over her failure to secure Britain's withdrawal from the EU, aka Brexit. She announced her resignation in a very emotional address to the nation. Time flies pretty fast, eh? It really feels like only recently that Brexit was a thing. It was gaining traction, but today, it's a shell of its former self and support has fallen off a cliff. In a very simplified explanation as to why Brexit was even on the table, the UK felt like they were carrying far too much of a burden and subsidizing the underperforming members of the EU. You can picture it as if you live in a house with a bunch of roommates and you all contribute to rent. Some people who don't make enough money pay proportional to that and they can only put up a couple of dollars, while since you take home more, you're forced to contribute a little bit more for the benefit of the entire collective. And as time went on, the UK also didn't like certain policies that the EU was enforcing upon them, so pressures mounted, and as a result, they felt like it was better for them to just leave the collective and become an individual nation. There's a lot of other caveats involved in that mix too, but at a high level, that's essentially what transpired. So, the first Brexit bill failed, then the next one came and it failed, and the third one came out and that failed too. Theresa May was unsuccessful time and time again. Why did that happen though? Critics will likely point out the Prime Minister's lack of effective policy making. You had multiple interest groups here who all had a stake in the decision, but instead of clearly having a stance, the PM tried to cater to a bunch of these parties at once, and in the end, nobody ended up getting serviced. Those people who didn't want to leave the EU were never going to be pleased regardless of whatever Brexit plan you made. Then you had those who wanted to leave, but they wanted a hard exit with no ties to the EU at all. Then there was also some middle group people who they wanted to leave, but they were also willing to seek a compromise. She lost the support of even her own party when a soft Brexit plan seemed to be the move. What does a soft Brexit plan mean? Well, essentially the UK would leave the EU, but it would keep strong economic ties, make budget contributions, and preserve the international border movements. People didn't like that, and instead of finding a support group that could really rally to her side, May found herself largely alone because not a lot of people wanted this idea and it didn't seem ideal to anyone. It was a pseudo middle ground, but it didn't pique anyone's fancy, so people wanted to flail it because they had a better idea of how things should be done. People were calling for her resignation from day one, and those pressures continued to mount and compound after each consecutive failure. If your own party isn't even backing you, you've got some major issues. PM May had a moment of pure desperation before her most recent failure. On her third bill attempt, she promised to resign as the PM if everyone would pass the Brexit deal she was proposing. People wanted her out, so in her mind, why not dangle that over their heads and maybe save my legacy at the same time? I'll resign, but I'll be the PM who passed Brexit, a monumental change to our country. At least she could go out with a win and have some glory. I call that the kamikaze maneuver, and I labeled it that when she declared it because it seemed almost suicidal. I'll offer up my position and end my political career if you make this last-ditch effort go through. The one thing she didn't account for, though, was people wanted her out and they didn't want her proposal. They wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too, which was very possible in the situation. They failed her bill and forced her out. It backfired hard on the PM, and she ended up just looking pitiful for one, and second, as if she had no power over her own constituents. At today's resignation assembly, May said she deeply regretted not being able to deliver Brexit, the issue that brought her to power in 2016, and it also consumed her premiership in the 3 years since. May said she would quit as leader of the Conservative Party on June 7th, but she would stay on as a prime minister until a successor is chosen. That process will be completed by the end of June, her party said. If I'm going to be quite honest, I find this whole debacle to be sad. She had a vision which had support at one point, and it's very likely she had good intentions, but the delivery was just not there. It was riddled with mistake after mistake. In her speech, she also said she had done everything she could to convince members of parliament to back her thrice rejected Brexit deal, but she acknowledged that she had failed. She also got very emotional at one point, started to choke up, and she cried a little bit. That really got to me. It made me think that people rarely see themselves as the bad guy. Probably in her mind, she was doing something important that had to be undertaken, and her approach was the best approach to her at that time. She did what she could, and she couldn't understand why people weren't backing her. She kept trying, and she believed in it, but it failed. Now, I'm not trying to give any condolence to her policy because I do think it was quite foolish, but I'm trying to say from the human perspective, you can see her motivations, and it's unclear to me if she was actually a bad person. It seemed more likely that she was just misguided, and it resulted in her losing her prime ministership, which is very tragic. She must have worked her whole life to get to that level, and now it's being taken away. Because one thing we have to note, it's not willing. This resignation was against her will, you could say. Her party members were claiming for it. People were at her neck trying to force her to resign. It wasn't her resigning. She didn't wake up one day and think it was a good idea to resign. She effectively had her hands tied, and that was the only outcome she could take. Once you lose the support of your party, it's a very quick descent into complete and utter mutiny. So, the UK is pretty screwed sideways from this fiasco because they already faced consequences of Brexit without it even happening. Companies started to move their headquarters away, people lost their jobs, and the economy is hurting. The biggest of those moves was probably Sony pulling out to avoid Brexit disruptions. If Brexit does not happen, they effectively took these L's for no reason. So, what's the next steps here? The Conservative MPs are going to vote on their preferred candidates, and by the end of June, the party said there will be a new leader in place. The top two choices will then be put forward before a wider party membership, who will then choose the leader from those two candidates, and by the time Parliament breaks for the summer, they should be in a place of power. The winner will then replace May as the Prime Minister, and she will effectively fade from the public spotlight. The best they can hope for is to get the country back on track. Further failure will compound the negative sentiments against the government, and more people will think they're just completely incompetent. It's very likely the country will continue to suffer until everything is resolved, so let's hope it's sooner rather than later, because this whole Brexit thing has put them on a path towards chaos, and it's been a long time, 3 years. I think they've had enough, and the people deserve some form of relief. So, that about does it for today. All these failures of prime ministers and premiers, let's hope next week there's some better news. So, if you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and follow us on Twitter at Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.